In my father's love for my mother who passed away, he dedicated his farm to cultivate her favorite flower. In life and in death, he surrounded her with the bright colors of chrysanthemum to bring a smile on her face and hoped that she would find her peace. However, his means to preserve my mother's memory had also led to his own death. Since the flowers were grown within 300 acres of land, he decided to become a supplier. While taking in some offers, he was approached by an unfamiliar client who purchased every stock we had. The man was also a cultivator of chrysanthemum flowers who was unable to meet his quota. My father was asked to deliver his harvest, but he never returned home. Along with the empty truck, his severed body was found at the side of the road. He was killed in such a gruesome manner that it looked unreal. Half of his body was missing, along with a big hole on the truck itself, as if it was busted by a grenade. However, there were no burn marks nor any trace of gunpowder left behind. There were no bends nor scrapes on the edges of the remaining parts either. Strangely enough, it looked like the hole was cut clean, as if it was removed along with half of my father's body. Nobody could figure out what kind of tool was used to do such a feat, nor why it was done. Without any family left, I had nothing else to hold on to but my hatred towards the nameless murderer. I swore on my father's grave that I would find the person who killed him no matter what it takes. I persistently pushed the authorities to follow up the case, but the investigation had gone stale for months. They seemed unmotivated to push through for some reason. They concluded that my father was killed to rob the truck that he was meant to deliver. One would easily question why thieves would choose to rob a truck full of flowers instead of something with more valuable items. Ironically, the person who contracted my father was also found dead a few days later. Since he was the only person that he talked to prior to his murder, the investigation had reached a dead end. However, I knew for a fact that there was someone else involved in the transaction. Father's harvest was only meant to go along with what his client already had on hand. I decided to do my own investigation, but my efforts were futile since my access to information was very limited. The authorities claimed that they were unable to identify the buyer who ordered such a huge sum of harvest from my father's client. With that kind of amount, I thought it would have been easier to trace the purchase record. It would have been obvious to see what it would be used for or where it would be shipped to. The flowers were missing, but there was no trace of the shipment in any records available. The amount was simply too much for an event, and so I assumed that it was meant for extraction. I tried to look out for the lists of company that involved tea, herbal medicine, organic perfumes, or anything which the flower was often used for. However, I couldn't find any establishment or brand that would need that much supply in a single order. When I realized that I couldn't rely on the authorities nor my own abilities to bring justice to my father's death, I decided to hire a private investigator instead. It was strangely difficult to find someone who was willing to handle the case, until I met Detective Leonard Higgins. He came to me of his own accord and volunteered to solve my father's murder. He was an old private investigator with a questionable reputation in the field because of his past records. They said he made up stories about the case he handled before, and they labeled him as a conspiracy theorist. I was desperate for help, and so I accepted his offer regardless of his dubious profile. Right from our very first meeting, he displayed these traits by telling me why nobody else was willing to help me. According to Higgins, there was more to my father's murder than what I initially thought. Apparently, he was already snooping around the case before he came to me. He used his connections to gain access to the reports and the evidence during the investigation. He already determined that the murder of my father and his client were connected. The client was Arnold Fisher, and he had been under Higgins' watch because of a former case that he wasn't able to solve. Arnold was killed inside of his home without any sign of torture nor struggle. He was killed by a shot in the head. There was no sign of forced entry, which suggested that he probably knew the assailant. Arnold led him into his house, where he was quickly killed by a single shot through his temple. He claimed that the case was left unsolved because it would lead to a highly influential person that the authorities wouldn't dare to suspect. Higgins came across Arnold's name when he investigated the suspicious transactions of a company owned by Edward White. He was a high-profile tycoon who owned several businesses across the country, and it was quite unlikely that someone like him would engage a trade with an average floriculturist. Arnold Fisher had a gambling problem and eventually sold a huge part of his land to pay for his debt. As a result, he was unable to produce enough harvest to fulfill his contract. According to the records that the authorities chose to hide from me, Arnold was applying for a couple of small establishments that were under a shipping company owned by Edward White. Aside from the fact that hundreds of flowers had no relevance to a shipping service whatsoever, it seemed improbable that a big company would commit a terrible crime for this reason. All of these speculations seemed quite a stretch at first, but then he found evidence that supported his claim. He snuck inside one of the shipping company's storage buildings, and he found some discarded boxes that were identical to what my father used to transport his harvest with. Higgins believed that my father was probably just at the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps he saw something that he shouldn't have and had to be silenced. As the contractor, Arnold Fisher was also taken out of the picture to cover their tracks. Edward White had both a good and bad reputation, depending on who was asked. He was known to support eco-friendly projects, and some of the buildings that he owned had incorporated nature with man-made structures. One of his biggest properties was a 200-floor tower with a grand garden at the very center of the structure, where natural trees and grasses were grown. This bold display of green landscape could be seen in his hotels, corporate offices, and other large establishments. They were all built deliberately out of place, and it was a mystery how a vegetation could strive so well despite its unnatural habitat. They appeared as if a piece of nature was transported inside a modernized space, and Edward White refused to disclose the secrets of his designers. He was also a major sponsor of the local police department, and it wasn't the first time that a crime was linked back to one of his companies. Higgins believed that his illegal activities were purposely being ignored since he practically owned the city and the authorities. According to his investigations in the past, the biggest one was an unlicensed mining activity where dozens of workers died when the beams collapsed. He also handled the case when one of the families of the workers approached him. But the records that proved Edward White's involvement in the project were conveniently erased. The site wasn't even known for containing any deposits, nor valuable stones that a businessman could benefit from. At the time, there were rumors that the miners were looking for something else entirely. According to one of the wives of the victims who asked for Higgins' help, the miners were only digging out of a gigantic hole with the boulders of solid stones. That statement was the beginning of Higgins' wild goose chase regarding the multi-million tycoon's purpose for his questionable operations, and he was deemed as delusional and foolish by the other detectives because of it. Unfortunately, all his efforts went down the drain when the charges were dropped before he could have a chance to ask more questions. The families were generously compensated, and most of them were even relocated to a different state. It was also clear that they were told not to speak of the case ever again when they all refused to be interviewed by anyone. The cover-up was clear as day, and yet nobody else but Higgins had dared to question it. At that point, I realized that I made the right choice of accepting his help. However, I also realized that my fight was against the biggest of the corporate giants. Unfortunately, our adversary was not limited to Edward White alone. As we dug deeper, more highly known personalities got tied into the case. Higgins wanted to know how a mere floriculturist became acquainted with a major shipping company, and we found our answer when we tracked down the son of Arnold Fisher. Higgins found out about Jamie Fisher when he traced his previous bank transactions. Regardless of his methods, he was a remarkable detective. Arnold was sending his son his allowance almost every month since he left the house a couple years ago. Jamie said he couldn't stand his father's gambling addiction and decided to make a life of his own, but he still needed some support from his old man. According to him, his father met a few reputable individuals while playing at casinos in the city. One of them was a retired general, Clifford Gaines. He told us that there were a few times when a military truck came to their house to pick up their chrysanthemum flowers. The next thing he knew, his father ended up delivering them regularly. He also wondered why a military man would purchase so many flowers of the same kind. But not even his father knew the reason behind it. All he cared about was the profit. And this also explained why he thoughtlessly sent another man to fill in his order without knowing that he would be killed for it. It seemed that the ex-General Clifford became the way for Arnold Fisher to be the regular supplier of Edward White's shipping company. The connection between these two men was not well known to the public, aside from a single photo of a private expedition that was taken almost 3 decades ago. This photo became quite controversial at the time because of the story behind it. Along with the general and the tycoon were the future senator and the CEO of the national aeronautic industry. Aside from these men who managed to strive within their fields, most of the people in the photo had gone missing. The expedition took place in the Arctic, but it was never disclosed what really happened to their fellow explorers and the rest of their crew. There were rumors about it which claimed that they found something there that was either ancient or extraterrestrial in nature. But these were just wild speculations from random people who believed in aliens and cryptids. Furthermore, they also said that the senator was a member of an elitist cult. The same rumor was also made towards ex-General Clifford, along with other heavy allegations such as mass kidnapping and murders. But none of these claims were ever proven. It was well known that Clifford's men were extremely loyal to him. Regardless of his orders and activities, they would take his secrets to their grave. With these new revelations flooding my head, I couldn't help but feel completely overwhelmed and powerless. I am but a son of a farmer who only wanted justice for my father's death, but I suddenly stumbled upon controversies one after another. I wondered what kind of approach I could take to make the people responsible for the murder face the consequence of their crimes when they all seemed to stand above the law, which was the only leverage I had as an ordinary citizen. Furthermore, there was a thought that lingered in my mind when these fragments of information strangely fell into place in the most surreal manner that I never would have imagined on my own. The mysterious expedition where people had gone missing, the unnatural vegetation in Edward White's buildings, the rumored cult of well-respected individuals, the regular orders of chrysanthemum flowers. Regardless of its validity, these details bizarrely coincided with an old tale. Based on what I've read since we started the investigation, all of these elements were connected to a belief of an ancient entity that was worshipped long before the rise of modern civilizations. In the story that I found by chance as I was searching for more information about the controversies against the mentioned individuals, there was an ancient god who represented creation and destruction that was far older than Ra, Osiris, or Shiva. He was portrayed as an ethereal being who towered over humans, and he could create life in the blink of an eye as well as take it. Chrysanthemum flowers were known to symbolize life and rebirth. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, it was also the favorite offering for the olden deity. However, he was not a mindful being who valued his creations, nor showed any empathy to his worshippers. According to the story, he created the universe and everything within it in a dream. To this god, the existence of life was just an idea from his subconscious imagination. The rumor said that this ancient entity was the one being worshipped by the cult of elites. The conspiracy theorists believed that they found something related to it during the expedition. This allegation also implied that Edward White and ex-General Clifford Gaines were also members of the aforementioned group. Or rather, those who survived the expedition had become the new forefathers of the cult. Some people also made their own assumptions regarding this far-fetched theory. Naturally, I read through them all out of curiosity. Aside from its questionable source, they were wondering why anybody would choose to worship an insensible deity who couldn't care less about their existence. Some people said that it was merely for the idea of believing something different from most people, a feeble attempt to feel special and unique by having a belief that only a handful of individuals would know. On the other hand, some people thought that the unknown god had become a source of the cult members' luck, which helped them rise up in their respective fields. It wouldn't be the first time for high-profile personalities to have a strong devotion about the supernatural. But everything so far were just baseless speculations until an evident proof could be found. Needless to say, this case went far beyond what I was expecting to discover. However, it would go even deeper and darker. The truth behind these conspiracies were more unfathomable than they already were. We should have known better than to snoop around the businesses of a multimillionaire without thinking that they would soon take notice. Higgins was mobilizing his assets from left to right, and he was bypassing legal methods to acquire new information. He told me that he found someone that could prove the existence of the cult and its members. Apparently, it was true, and there were many crimes that could be tied to it since it existed. That was the last thing I heard from him. Higgins suddenly disappeared, and the authorities had no intention to look for him. They gave me a stern warning when I told them everything that we discovered prior to Higgins' disappearance. The authorities themselves told me to steer clear from the case and everything that was connected to it, including my father's murder. It couldn't get any more obvious that they were protecting him, and there was nobody left to help me. I should have given up right there and then. I had no interest in proving the existence of the cult nor their activities. I just wanted justice for my father. With sheer determination and nothing left to lose, I picked up where Higgins left off. I lurked around the shipping company for days until an opportunity arose. Coincidentally, it was when large crates of chrysanthemum flowers showed up that I was able to sneak inside the property. I knew that they had to move it fast since it would eventually wither, and so I took the chance to know where they would deliver it. Without hesitation, I jumped inside the cargo truck. I wanted to know the real reason why they needed so many flowers since it led to my father's death. I kept myself hidden behind dozens of crates filled with nothing but flowers. And I had no idea where we were going since the cargo was concealed. I was far from prepared. I had to endure my hunger and thirst since we were on the road for an entire day. The road was bumpy for hours, and then it suddenly went very smoothly. Without seeing where we were going, I could tell that we were driving on a cemented ground. I started feeling very nervous when I heard a big gate opening, since I could tell that we already entered a private property at that point. However, the truck kept going on for miles before it finally stopped. The place was incredibly big. A few moments later, I felt the ground shifting. The truck was being lowered far down. Aside from the vast space outside, there was also an area underground that was at least 15 floors deep, based on how long it took before the elevator stopped. I desperately squeezed myself inside one of the crates before they opened the truck. Luckily for me, they hoisted the crates with a forklift and were not able to notice the obvious differences in weight. Through the small gaps between the planks, I was able to see the area. The underground looked like a vast nuclear bunker that had more than enough space to house small buildings inside it. We were passing by some structures that looked like some kind of facility units, but I couldn't tell what they were for. The surrounding walls were all made of solid concrete, and the ceiling was extraordinarily high. I merely snuck inside the shipping truck to see where the flowers were being used. I never would have thought that it would be brought to such a place. Blinded by desperation, it was too late when I realized that I had put myself in a situation that was far beyond what I could ever comprehend. I slid out of the crate once the cargo was laid on the floor. I had the feeling that they would soon empty them out, and I would definitely be killed if they found out that I snuck in. When I looked around, I also saw some unnatural vegetation growing out of the concrete floor. None of it was making any sense at all. But what I saw up to that point was nothing compared to what I discovered next. I cautiously walked around, and I found myself surrounded by trees. It was quite perplexing to come across a forest in an enclosed place several feet below the surface. I just kept on moving further until I reached an area with mounds of flowers surrounding a large crater. And at the center of that deep slope was a young child, soaking its feet on a running fountain. I finally saw where they were bringing the chrysanthemum, but I still couldn't tell why they were there. I tried to get as close to the edge of the slope without revealing myself, and I thought that my mind was playing tricks with me when I saw it happen. The image of the boy was fluctuating, and he was shifting from one place to another within the crater. I was deeply dumbfounded, and I did not notice right away that I was already being surrounded by a couple of armed men. The place was so big and the ceiling was so high, I did not realize that I was already being captured by the surveillance cameras scattered all over the area. I knew right there and then that I was done for. But the situation took an unexpected turn when the boy inside the crater suddenly appeared right before me. The mysterious boy did not say a single word, and yet I was utterly petrified. Being so close to him sent shivers down my spine. My heart was pounding violently as cold sweat flowed across my face. Apparently, I was not the only one who was profoundly shaken by his presence. The armed men who came for me also started backing away slowly. The boy turned his head to one of them, and what happened next was so incomprehensible that I still couldn't believe it, even if I saw it with my own eyes. Everything within the radius where the armed man was standing just suddenly disappeared in the blink of an eye. It looked as if that particular space itself was completely erased. And it was the same thing that happened to my father and the truck. And when the boy turned his head at me, I was so terrified that I couldn't even scream. He casually walked towards me and took a sniff of my clothes. Every inch of my body was shaking as he stood just a few inches away from me, and I collapsed on my knees when he finally teleported himself back inside the crater. The remaining person escorted me back to one of their facilities. And there, I finally met Edward White himself. Surprisingly, he told me who the boy was and explained everything that I wanted to know. Unlike other forms of faith where the beliefs were focused on spirituality and the life after death, this entity that was dubbed as the god of destruction and creation was very real. And it was the boy that I encountered at the crater. We went down to the lower area where he showed me what they found during their expedition in the Arctic. And I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw a 30-foot coffin encased in a crystallized slab. Inside the encased coffin was the physical body of the sleeping god, and it was being strictly monitored to make sure that it remains concealed. Edward White explained to me that the boy was nothing but a projected image of the god in his dreams, and the chrysanthemum flowers were helping to keep him asleep. Since the boy was just a projection of himself, he could go anywhere he pleased. The greeneries in Edward White's building were his doing, and so were the casualties. Edward practically bought every property that the god often visited to make sure that he would be kept in check. Unfortunately, the god was attracted by the smell of the chrysanthemum flowers when my father delivered his harvest, and he was probably not pleased by the way he reacted when he saw him teleporting. The accident in the mine was one of their attempts to bury the god once again, but his consciousness remained active ever since they found him. Apparently, the cult was not a group of fanatics who worshipped the olden deity. They were the ones who were doing everything they could to keep him at bay. Edward White and the other members were guilty of many crimes, but they did what they had to in order to hide the existence of the olden god. He also admitted the murder of the detective and the floriculturist. He feared that if the government found out about the encased coffin, they would handle the situation differently and pry it open. If a mere projection of the god already had the power to effortlessly destroy anything within its gaze, one could only imagine the catastrophic magnitude of his true abilities when he finally wakes up from his slumber. Needless to say, he initially intended to silence me as well. 2 months later, I came back with a truck full of chrysanthemum flowers. And I continue to do so every harvest.